We're going to first introduce Tom Sutow, who is located in Cleveland, Ohio. He's a past Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs vice president. He's been our fundraising chair for the last couple of years, doing a great job. And let's see, today he is a vice president of Team Northeast Ohio and director of business development, a global cardiovascular innovation center. Tom has worked with many Israeli companies, has presented seminars in Israel for Israeli businesses, and through the GCIC has invested in 5 Israel biomedical companies in the past 4 years. He travels to Israel for business 2 or 3 times a year and is frequently a lecturer at Israeli businesses conferences. For his outstanding work, he has been recognized with awards from many economic development and community organizations. Without further ado, Tom Sutow.
So I'm going to present you with a little bit of an overview, and then we're going to get into some more specifics with our other 2 speakers. When I first went to Israel about 40 years ago, you thought about Israel, you thought about the kibbutznik with the kobel temple on, the inverted sailor's hat, sitting on the tractor bouncing along, right? That was Israel. Israel was an agrarian society. Israel was a developing country, and Israel didn't have much to offer. In my words, Israel at that point was a taker. It was relying on our donations and on other things to begin to move forward. Over the last 40 years, there's been an absolute revolution in Israel. And the Israel of today is not the Israel of 40 years ago. It's also not the Israel that and please don't take this the wrong way, a number of nonprofits that try to raise money for Israel paint. There is social problems in Israel, and they're substantial. But there's also tremendous wealth and tremendous investment opportunities. A couple things came together to forge this to happen. In the late 1980s and 1990s, we were successful in unlocking the doors of the Soviet Union, and 1 million Soviet Jews emigrated to Israel. When they arrived in Israel, they all came and said, "We're engineers. We're engineers," right? And the Israelis laughed at them, and they were sweeping the streets in Dimona and other places in Israel. And people began to realize these people really were engineers. And many of them had gone through many, many advanced degrees, PhDs and beyond, in Russia, but couldn't get jobs. They were locked out of most industries in Russia because they were Jewish, except for the instrument control industry. They could do the space, but these were highly educated people. The Israelis in 1991 launched a series of incubators, business incubators, 21 of them, that they put into cities. And they took a number of these engineers and they put them in these incubators to begin to create ideas. Second, the Israeli Defense Forces when they need a product developed, they take the best and brightest in the Israeli Defense Forces and they put them in charge to develop the product. So as an example, when they needed to build the whole UAV, the spy satellites and unmanned aircraft, a lot of that was developed in Israel. They needed a camera. They took some young scientists, put them through college, put them through degrees at the Technion University, and they created a miniaturized camera to go into the wings of the UAV. Why is this story important? Because when you leave the Israeli army, the Israeli Defense Forces, you can take whatever you invented with you. So you've got young people, 25 to 30 years old at that point in time, the best and the brightest, who are managing projects in the Israeli Defense Forces of $20 to $30 million, managing a team of people. Sounds like they're being trained to be a CEO, much better than getting an MBA, by the way. Many of them finish and do get MBAs. And they're running the project. And when they leave, they can take the intellectual property with them. That means they can take that camera, which they did, they can take that camera and put it to any use beyond defense. And they can own, they can patent it and they can own it. So a guy named Gavi Marone and a few of his counterparts took that camera, took their experience in running a a project, and they created what's called Given Imaging. Given Imaging is the pill can, which went public on it was the NASDAQ stock exchange about a dozen years ago. Okay. In Israel, they have to be innovative. So none of the drug companies in the United States wanted to sell to Israel. First, they didn't want to upset the Arabs. Many of the world drug companies, they want to sell in Israel in the 60s and 70s. And they don't want to upset the Arab world. And plus, they thought the market was too small. So they said to the Israelis, they said to a small company called Teva, if you can develop these products, put the medication on the market. Well, Teva developed the mechanism, and they became one of the world leaders. I think it's the fourth largest drug company in the area of generic drugs. So the Israelis use their innovative attitude, they use their training to bring products to market. So in the last 6 months alone, there are 3 Israeli startups that have sold for close to $1 billion. Waze was the most recent one a month ago that sold to Google. I think it was Google. Google and Apple were in a bidding war over it, and they played it out very well for $1.3 billion. And every day I read a newsletter called Globes. It's the Israel Business Journal, it's like the Wall Street Journal. And every day there's more companies being sold for 20 and 30 and 40 and $50 million. And more. And multiples of that, 10 and 20 fold. In 2006, Warren Buffett, the great guru from Omaha, went to Israel, and he said, some Americans have come to the Middle East looking for oil. We came to the Middle East looking for brains, and we stopped at Israel. And they invested multiple billions of dollars in a company called Issachar, which is a metals company. Today, Israel has become a center of innovation. There are more stock, and the U.S. exchange is beyond, right today, I think China's closing it beyond U.S. and Canada. On the U.S. exchanges, Israel is the next country with stocks being traded. I have a whole list, and I know we're going to get into it later, page after page of Israeli technologies that are traded on U.S. exchanges. And I mentioned some, Teva and Given Imaging and others. You can find them, and I know we're going to have a speaker who will talk about those directly. I want to spend some of my time talking about another unique opportunity. And I'll say very clearly, I'm not an employee of this company. I'm friends with people who work in the company. I'm fascinated by what they're doing. Anything I represent, Steve sitting here is our attorney. It doesn't represent the FJMC. It doesn't represent any of the organizations that I work for. It's just I'm passing this on as information. There's an investor in Israel whose name is John Medved. John Medved ran a company called Israeli Seed Investments. He then ran a company called Gringo. Gringo sold to this guy who owns the Dallas Mavericks, whose name is Mark Cuban, for a very high multiple. John created a company in the last year called Our Crowd. Our Crowd is a crowdfunding platform for Israeli technologies. Crowdfunding is where you hear about an investment and individual investors can then invest in it in small multiples, thousands and $2,000. Again, these are very high-risk investments, but it's low money. John's Our Crowd, which now employs about 40 people in the last year, it works only with accredited investors, which means you have to have some minimums to be able to invest in it. Not what you'll invest, but you have to have some secured minimums. I think it's $200,000, if I'm not mistaken, of assets to be able to participate as an accredited investor. They then do due diligence on a whole host of companies, most of them Israelis, and then by email and Twitter and all kinds of things, they pass out to their investment community. Here's some opportunities, and here's why we think it's a good opportunity. They've done, I think, now about 30 investments in the last year. These are all very early stage investments. And most of them have strong ties to Israeli technologies. It's www.ourcrowd.com. You can look it up. And it's a way that you can dabble in an Israeli investing without going in head over heels. There are a lot of people who've lost a lot of money investing in Israeli startups. There's also a lot of people who made a lot of money investing in Israeli startups. I mentioned the incubator movement. There are now a number of incubators that have become privatized. They're now owned by major companies, by investment firms, to move technologies along. But that's a long and winding road. For the average investor, you want to be involved in Israel, something like our crowd for angel investing and targeted investing in certain startup companies is a great way to go. Don't just invest with somebody who knocks on your door. Israelis are very good at developing product. They are masters at developing new innovation. 40% of the cell phone that I carry is developed in Israel. Instant messaging developed in Israel. I mentioned the pill cam. Anybody here carrying a laptop computer, all the Intel work is done there. All the major companies in the high-tech and bioscience world are in Israel regularly. I was in Israel. I'm in the bioscience world. I've been in Israel with the heads of Medtronic and Boston Scientific, not traveling with me, but at conferences that they were at and speaking at. They all know about it, and are all investing heavily into it.
What's the fee on our crowd? Is it a 2 plus 20?
I don't have all the details, but you can look it up online. I think they take a percentage. The biggest percentage comes on the back end. The other thing with our crowd is they represent all their investors as one investment unit with the company, because the company doesn't want to be able to move things around. But again, a lot of people in Israel have made a lot of money on investments, and it's from these technologies. I mentioned Intel's bought Intel, Microsoft, Warren Buffett, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble has 3 people who do nothing in Israel but scout for new technologies. Who I have, through Mike Mills, I had the opportunity of meeting on several occasions. So there's a lot of activity. It's a great place, but it's also a bit of the wild, wild west. So non-traditional funding is, I mentioned our crowd is in angel investing, and there's more traditional investing we're going to hear, like Israel bonds, and like investing in I think it's well over 100 stocks that are now being traded in the United States from Israeli companies.
Chicago.
Thank you.
Okay.